Good afternoon, and welcome to our workshop, our webinar today called Short History of Eugenics in Wisconsin. My name is Tim Markle. I am the director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. We are part of the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities that's out of the Waisman Center on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. This is the final day of National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. And so we thought we would go out with a bang and invited Kacie Lucchini Butcher to come and join us today to talk about a short history of eugenics. She is a public historian whose work is dedicated to building empathy, advancing social justice, and serving marginalized communities as they reclaim their historical narratives. She's currently director of the UW-Madison Public History Project, which is a multi-year effort to uncover and give voice to the histories of discrimination, exclusion, and resistance on campus. The project will culminate in a physical and digital exhibit, public lectures, and curricular materials that will allow the Madison community to reckon with its history. Prior to coming to UW, Kacie was the co-curator of the award-winning exhibit Owning Up, Racism and Housing in Minneapolis, which documented the history of racial housing discrimination and its effects on the city today. She's active in the public history community, hosting events and community conversations, attending trainings, editing publications, emailing back and forth to me as I try to get all of the details correct of what's going to happen. And she holds 2 committee positions for the National Council on Public History. And so instead of me talking about eugenics, I am excited beyond belief that we have Kacie here to share her expertise, her learning, her knowledge, and transfer that to us so that we can learn more about the history of UW and Wisconsin and figure out what we can do moving forward. Thank you, Kacie, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, thanks for that big introduction. I'm gonna get my slides going here. Yeah, and thank you so much for organizing this. This is a topic that I think is really, it's a great time to talk about it now. And there's a lot of kind of connections between the history and today. And so I'm really, really excited that we got to do this right in under the wire before March ends. So yeah, I've titled the presentation today, Reckoning with Our History, Eugenics in Wisconsin, and I'll be talking a little bit about the kind of eugenics history that we've come across while I've been working at UW-Madison and studying this history, but also some of the kind of general context history in the United States. So Tim did a great job introducing me, but you still might be like, who is this person? What does she have to say about all these things? I'm a public historian, which, is one of those jobs that is very confusing for family members at holidays. So if I have to sum it up for people, what I say is that I make history accessible to the public. So that happens in a lot of different ways. We learn about history in a lot of ways outside the classroom. The primary work that I do is exhibit development. So I've done a lot of exhibits. There's a picture of me here with my first exhibit, Owning Up, Racism and Housing in Minneapolis. But I've also done other types of things that get history to the public. So presentations like this, I would consider public history, but also working on podcasts and publications, talking to people, working in museum settings, talking on the radio, TV, any way that we get history to the public outside of the classroom, that's what I do. But currently I work as the Public History Project Director at UW-Madison. So I want to give a brief background on that project, which is really the project that exposed me to this research and where we kind of found a lot of the information I'll present on today. So the Public History Project started a few years ago because of this photo in the 1924 Badger Yearbook. So if you go to the Badger Yearbook, they're available online, and you go to the 1924 section on student organizations, you'll find this photo. And in the 1920s, there were 2 organizations on campus that bore the name of the Ku Klux Klan. One that was officially associated with the Klan, and this honors fraternity pictured here that was not officially associated with the Klan, but chose to take the name. And the original research about these groups came out in 1993 in the Wisconsin Magazine of History, but it wasn't really until the violence in Charlottesville in 2017 that the campus community wanted more information and started taking a closer look at this history. And that's when Chancellor Rebecca Blank commissioned a committee of historians and community members to do some more research. That report's available online if you're interested. One of the kinds of conclusions of the report, or one of the questions, was, it's great that we know all about these groups on campus, but this is such a small segment of our university's history. What about all the other histories of discrimination on campus? And that was really what started the Public History Project. So this is part of our mission statement. We aim to recover and acknowledge the history of exclusion on campus through the voices of those who experienced and resisted it. So we have taken our mandate to be very, very broad. So we look at 150 years of university history, over 150 years really. We look at all racial and ethnic identities. We look at discrimination against LGBTQ folks, folks with disabilities, religious discrimination. When we say discrimination, we really look at it all. And it was in this kinds of research that we were doing on disability history at UW and against about discrimination against folks with disabilities that we came across a lot of the history that I'm going to present to you today. So as a project, we have some kind of final things that we are working towards. So we have a physical exhibit, which is going to open this upcoming fall. It'll open September 12th and run through December 30th of 2022 at the Chazen. So mark your calendars for that. We'll also have a digital exhibit website. So that will, kind of be a place where people can see all of the information of our project, but also get more. So, more research, more archival materials to really deepen that engagement. We're also looking at, one of the things, fancy way of saying this is place-based interpretation, but like, how do we tell our history across campus, right? And what histories are we highlighting and which ones are we not? And then educational tools. So this is a big one for us. We really look at, as an educational institution, researching the history is not enough. How are we making sure that our campus community is learning from this history? So if you want to follow along with the project, we have a newsletter that comes out once a month, and I can drop the link to that in the chat where you can sign up. We also have an Instagram account. You can follow us there and really stay up to date with everything that we're doing. So today, I'm here to share some of this history that we found in regards to the history of eugenics, history in Wisconsin, and its connection to UW-Madison. And the reckoning framework is something that we use a lot for the Public History Project, but it's something that I think is really useful to look at when we're studying any type of history. And reckoning is this kind of like big, scary word, right? It's one of those words that I think about a lot and that I think demands a lot of reflection. This is the dictionary definition of reckoning. And so to me, the more I kind of study and think about why do we look at history? What is the point of studying the past? I come back to this word reckoning, right? Which is that we're always trying to kind of grapple with, reckon with the past and how it affects our present. This is the dictionary definition, and I've come to view this in particular when it comes to history as a step-by-step process. And so I bring this up and present it now because as we work through all this history and I present on it, kind of keep this framework in mind, right? Studying history for me, and I think for a lot of historians, is not just about learning a rote set of facts about the past, but it's more about what do we want to do about that history? How do we see it affecting us? How do we see it affecting our lives and our communities? So, the first step in the historical process is calculating, estimating, researching something, right? Where did discrimination happen in the past and who did it happen to? The second step is, our views and our opinions and judgments. This is something I think as people who study history, we're not often taught, growing up, whether that's in history classes in high school or elsewhere, we're not really taught that it's okay to have feelings about the past. We're going to have opinions and judgment and views about the past, and that's a normal part of the historical process. And the last part, I think, is where the most important part for me and the part where I think history has kind of a radical potential. And that's what do we want to do about it, right? What is the point of studying history? And one of, I think, the things that we know is that we study history because we hope to learn something from it, right? About the human experience or about how we got to where we are. And so important part is kind of reflecting on what we want to do in the future and how the history might shape that. So, before we jump into the history, just want to give a content warning. Obviously, we're talking about eugenics in Wisconsin today, and a lot of the content is disturbing. There's just no kind of way to talk around it. Another important thing is that, I've pulled quotes in here because I think it's really important to be clear about who said what. We could use euphemisms. I could be really vague about what was said, but I think that using the language that they used and really being forced to confront that language is really important, and it's a part of the history. So some of that's going to be coming up in this presentation. Just wanted to give you a warning. Obviously, you all are in your own homes or offices, so if you need to take a break, you need to walk away, this is being recorded. You can always watch it later. Feel free to take care of yourself, make sure to do that because the content is disturbing. So we will hop right in and get started where all good stories start, which is at the beginning. So I'll give you kind of a brief overview of the history of eugenics in the United States more broadly before we get to Wisconsin. And these ideas really began to flourish with these two white men, Sir Francis Galton and Charles Darwin. Darwin's book on the origin of species was released in 1859, and it posited a lot of ideas about natural selection, which is the idea that weaker traits are bred out of animal genes gene pools over generations. Galton became obsessed with this book, as many people did. This is, one of the best-selling books of all time. It was kind of this huge thing when it came out, and it continues to influence a lot of the scientific field. And so Sir Francis Galton, when this came out, was obsessed with the book. And he eventually used Charles Darwin's book, which led him to his theory on nature versus nurture. And this is the idea that hereditary characteristics are more important than the environment that you grow up in. And so this is something that I think, as you probably see as we go on, comes to really affect the eugenics conversation. And notably, Galton is the one who coined the term eugenics. So he was deep into this kind of area of study. And the wider kind of acceptance of Darwin's ideas on natural selection came at a time as well. I think it's important to note that immigration in the United States began to grow exponentially. So there was a lot of concerns about falling birth rates of middle, upper class white people. In other words, rich people, and in particular scientists and well-to-do people, thought that the wrong people were procreating and having children, and that the wrong people were immigrating to the United States. And so it really was kind of in this context that the eugenics movement found this kind of space to flourish. And as I talked about with Darwin and this kind of idea about hereditary traits in the gene pool of animals, it was plant and animal breeding that became kind of a proof positive that eugenics worked. So it became the rationale for eugenic policy. If it worked on animals, why would it not work on our kids? And that's something that you literally see in this material. So this is a poster that was created by the American Eugenics Society. It was displayed in eugenics education pavilions at state fairs. And these were kind of a very common thing to see at state fairs because, you had all this plant and animal breeding going on at state fairs. So you can see here, it kind of talks about pure plus pure equals children normal. So again, talking about how the hereditary elements are working here, but also about, why would we leave it up to chance, right? We have this thing, we think it works because we see it on animals and plants. Why wouldn't we use it to influence our society? And breeders' associations, including academic departments who studied animal breeding, really played a central role in the spread of these ideas. And eugenics policy in the United States were really, really rampant during the 20th century. This is like a very famous map that you see. So this is eugenic sterilization in the US by January of 1935. So it's how much of it is happening. And there are three kinds of main policies that we see that are working for the eugenics movement at this time. There's sterilization laws. So people who are being forcibly sterilized by the state so that they cannot reproduce. There are marriage laws, and the marriage laws work in a similar way, right? They only grant marriage licenses to people who you believe are worthy of marriage and therefore by extension worthy of procreation. And then also with marriage laws, we have anti-miscegenation laws, right? So this is laws that forbid people of different races from marrying and therefore hopefully from having children as well. And then immigration laws. And so we have immigration laws that are cracking down at the same time because, again, who is coming to the United States and who is having children? And there's a lot of concerns about who those people are and about having the right people come to the United States. So as I kind of mentioned, animal breeding was seen as the proof positive, and UW-Madison had a huge hand in creating this field. Our current Department of Genetics was established as the Department of Experimental Breeding in 1910. It was the first such department in the United States. And Leon J. Cole was the first chair. He's pictured here in his dapper suit standing on the stairs. And he was the sole member of the department for 8 years. And it was really under his guidance that the department flourished and that the eugenic ideas flourished as well. So on the left here, I've just included a little snippet about the first eugenics club at the university. And so there was a eugenics club at UW-Madison. It was really, really popular. It was, they held meetings twice a month. They did lectures and discussions about eugenic policy. And as you can see here, questions pertaining to the physical, mental, and moral improvement of the human race. It had about 75 members, but it had 100 regular attendees. So we know it was a pretty popular campus club. The university was obviously a lot smaller and had a much lower student population than it does now. So upcoming next, just there are some more quotes. And so I'll try and give warnings when things are coming up. And, I bring up the quotes and I put them on the screen because I think it's really important to be clear about who said what, and in particular when we talk about the effects of that. And so here are some quotes from Leon J. Cole. He wrote about the relation of eugenics to euthenics, and euthenics is like the study of the household. And this was in Popular Science Monthly, so a huge magazine that went out. And he said, what kind of philanthropist is he who, though he gives millions to charity, well-intentioned, but perhaps misdirected, dilutes and contaminates the very structure of our commonwealth by the importation of the scum of Europe to enable him to mass the millions? The danger would perhaps be not so great if there were not the possibility of control of affairs ultimately falling in the hands of these undesirables. With political control in hands of the inferior, there will be little chance for eugenic legislation. So what he's talking about here is that there's increased immigration, and that eventually there might be the possibility that immigrants will outnumber the kind of wealthy, rich white men who are here, and that could swing political control. And if eugenicists don't work quickly and get eugenic legislation on the books before that happens, it'll never happen at all. And, one of the things when I think kind of about the relation of UW-Madison to the history of eugenics more broadly is that academic institutions have a lot of credibility in our society, right? And in particular at this time, I would say they probably have even more credibility than we think of now. Because now I think there's higher education is it can be a space where there's a lot of critique. At the time, these are institutions that are really revered, right? UW-Madison is seen as this premier research institution. What these professors say is very, very important and is taken very, very credibly. And so when Leon J. Cole is publishing things like this and is supporting these ideas, people in the state are paying attention, right? And in particular, legislators are paying attention. And so it's really important, I think, to quote him directly, but to also be really clear that this had an impact. This wasn't just read by 5 people and nothing happened. He is a very important person, and he's being read by very important people. So another person spreading these ideas, also at UW-Madison at the time, but has a really significant impact outside of UW-Madison, is Edward Ellsworth Ross. He's a professor of sociology at UW-Madison in the early 20th century. He was less of a hard sciences person. He was, really into the kind of social ideas, I would say, that undergird the eugenics movement. So he was really into social Darwinism, which takes the scientific properties of Darwinism and transfers it to social relations. So a core belief of social Darwinism, if you really just strip it down to the bare minimum, is that wealthy people breed wealthy people, smart people breed smart people, not because they have more access to money or education, but because of their genetics, that there are genetic materials that affect our social relations. So again, getting into the Galton nature versus nurture idea. Edward A. Ross, I think, is more famous for his racist ideas than he is for his eugenic ideas, but I would argue they go hand in hand. He is the man who termed the coin race suicide, which is like a kind of very vile racist idea, and one that we still see in use very frequently in like alt-right circles. And in this kind of idea of race suicide, he warned that Anglo-Saxons were allowing a swelling population of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Asia who, along with African Americans, would out-reproduce and thus be able to take political control of the United States. So again, Leon J. Cole, it has the same concern. He's here at the same time as Ross. They absolutely know one another. And it's 2 very, very credible men, one from the hard sciences, one from the social sciences, really putting all of their energy into spreading these ideas, talking about these ideas, publishing on these ideas, and collaborating together on them. Which brings me to another individual at UW-Madison who also has a huge following, who is also very influential, Charles Van Heist, and was a huge supporter of eugenics. Van Heist was the first person to be awarded a PhD from UW-Madison. He was the first graduate of UW-Madison to serve as the university's president. He served from 1903 to 1918 when he died unexpectedly from a routine surgery. His field of study was geology, which is always kind of weird. People are like, how did he get into eugenics? but he did. And it was really because he too loved Darwin, which I'll talk about in a second. I would say he was also probably most remembered for the Wisconsin idea. A lot of people, I'm not sure if they know that. It kind of depends how much of a Wisconsin idea nerd you are. But he did create the Wisconsin idea. This is an excerpt from the speech, one of his speeches on the Wisconsin idea. And the idea argues that what happens in UW-Madison should benefit the state of Wisconsin, the entirety of the state, right? So the research that happens here, the science that happens here should be spread out into the state. And when you know that, and when you know that he supported that idea and that that's his idea, I think it can take a lot more of a sinister tone thinking about what we know happens next with a lot of the eugenic science coming out of the institution, right? You have this eugenic science coming out and they're taking that Wisconsin idea and spreading that throughout the state, and getting these eugenic policies on the books. So he was a vocal proponent of eugenics. He seemed to be introduced to the idea through Charles Darwin's book. We have letters between him and his wife that ended up in the UW archives, and he was really enthralled with these ideas. He was very interested in the work and its implications for society, and he kind of immediately saw it as something that could be used for the moral benefit of society. So we have some more quotes here from him. So in a lecture that he gave on the conservation movement, which comes from his geology background, right? He's thinking conservation of natural resources. So that's his kind of a lens, which is a really interesting way to go from geology to eugenics, but that's what he's thinking. He's thinking conservation of natural resources. Oh, also humans are natural resources. So he claimed that eugenics policy was the best means of conserving human resources. So again, people as a resource for the state. He recommended that, quote, as a very first moderate step toward the development of the stamina of the human race, defectives should be precluded from continuing the race by some proper method. He stated that he viewed sterilization as the proper method. Another method he mentioned in this lecture was the segregation of social defectives, because the result of eradication would also occur. So he essentially was thinking that these people should be locked away from the rest of society. He admitted that, quote, human defectives should no longer be allowed to propagate the race. According to Van Heist, defectives were those individuals who suffered from mental and physical disabilities. It's very, very clear in the writing, both from Van Heist and others at the time, that they really saw these individuals as subhuman, as less than human, and as not worthy of human dignity. And they talk about them in that way as well. And this is just kind of one brief one from his publications. This is another one. This is called The Idea of Service. It's a speech that he gave. And in this speech, he's talking about service as a principal idea and the purpose of higher education, right? That we create these institutions because we believe that they serve this social purpose, this idea of service to the nation. And in this sense, his idea of service is eugenics. That's what he believes we can spread, not only to the rest of the state of Wisconsin, but also throughout the society at large. So he says, quote, we know enough about the breeding of animals so that if that knowledge were applied to man, the feeble-minded would disappear in a generation and the insane and criminal class could be reduced to a small fraction of their present numbers. And it's I like this quote as well, because the other thing that we're seeing here is a lot of talk about mental illness when the eugenics movement. So anybody who was seen as mentally ill was also seen as somebody who was a candidate for sterilization, and the criminal class. And so a lot of this got wrapped up into kind of crime and legislation law at the time. There's a lot of great writing about why that happens. And a lot of it is because you have booming cities. So you have lots of big cities where there's lots of factory jobs, population is booming, and crime is booming. And so what they do is they start to transfer this eugenic policy onto people who commit crimes. And so this didn't happen as much in the state of Wisconsin, but it happened elsewhere where people who were, convicted of 2, 3, 4 crimes, they would be forcibly sterilized because they believed that if those people were allowed to have children, their children would also be criminals, on and on and on. And so it's not just people with disabilities, right? They're kind of anybody who is seen as outside of what they deem as normal or what they deem as fit for society is wrapped up in the eugenics movement and is targeted in a lot of these sterilization policies. As I mentioned earlier, Van Heist died unexpectedly during a routine surgery in 1918, which was really during the height of the eugenics movement. And so a question I get a lot is like, well, did he change his mind? Did he, did his thinking advance on it? And it's impossible to say. because he passed away. So we don't know. Maybe, in 10, 20 years, his thinking would have changed. Maybe he would have grown as more science would have come out. But it's impossible to say. It's a very unsatisfying answer, but it's the truth. So, moving out a little bit from UW-Madison specifically and into the kind of broader state of Wisconsin, what you have is these individual men who have this kind of academic credibility at UW-Madison, spreading these ideas out and through the state. And they're gaining support across from all these different people who are required to kind of have their support to make this system work. And Alfred Wilmarth, pictured here, moved to Wisconsin from Pennsylvania. He was the first director of what was called the Home for the Feeble-Minded in Chippewa Falls. I was trying to find a historic photo of this, and no joke, I found a postcard from this place on eBay that's available to buy right now. I was kind of shocked that there was postcards created for it. And he really, in all the kind of eugenic literature about the state of Wisconsin, he is described as having waged a, quote, one-man war in support of eugenics. He rarely missed the opportunity to extol the virtues of practicing eugenics in the state. He brought with him, when he came to the state and when he started kind of working in this field, he brought with him the notion that people are not only mentally, but morally responsible here. So that he believed that not only was it important to do eugenics for the mental kind of, stamina of the human population, but morally you could judge people and who was fit to procreate. His influence over a large number of sterilizations, including what he called habitual criminals and unchaste women. So again, moving out past just disability, but also into other people who are seen as less than human in society. People have described his influence over sterilizations as immense. He is especially credited for advocating for sterilization. He was the first person in the state to advocate for sterilization in 1905. And he advocated for sterilization above confinement. He thought it was more efficient, it was more fiscally responsible. So he ran this center, the Home for the Feeble-Minded in Chippewa Falls. There were two main centers where people were, for lack of a better term, but I think it's accurate, incarcerated, where people were locked up in these facilities and were often sterilized. This was one of the main two, depending on what year each one kind of flip-flopped in who did more sterilizations. But he was the kind of superintendent of this. And on the next one, I have a quote from him that I think is one of the more disturbing ones, just as a warning. This is in his biannual reports. So when the center opened, when he took over, he did a biannual report. And he proudly noted that there were 3 objectives in establishing the home, and that the 3 were already being realized. So the first was that relief of overburdened families. The, quote, idiot child takes a major portion of the mother's time and robs other children of their care, which is due. The curtailment of the increase of feeble-mindedness and epilepsy by the sequestration of feeble-minded women of childbearing age, so that they're curtailing this population in the state by incarcerating feeble-minded women, and the education of the, quote, imbecile to the highest sphere of usefulness. And the usefulness, I think we could probably spend a whole dissertation talking about what Wilmarth thought was usefulness, which was not a lot. I think that he was somebody who in his writings and in a lot of things you read about him saw very little humanity in the people that he was purported to serve and work with, and I honestly think would have been more violent if he was able to be so. So these are kind of like the main players. And I would say in particular, Wilmarth is the one who bridges this really important gap between the academic study, the actual facilities and kind of medical people who are doing a lot of the work, and the law. And that's where we kind of get to, I would say, the kind of the law piece of this, how this is actually happening. And I use this stool metaphor because I think it's really easy to look to men like Cole and Ross and Wilmarth and say, oh, look at these bad guys, right? These are the guys. If these guys wouldn't have done that, this would have never happened. And that's not true, right? Like, other people would have absolutely stepped up to fill that void. But also all these people have to work together. So to make these laws work, to make eugenics stand up in the state, you have to have these working in concert. So you have people like Wilmarth, who are medical professionals who run these centers, who provide these centers, who do sterilizations, and who are the ones who approve sterilizations. Then you have academics and scientists, right? The people who kind of give that undergirding, that academic credibility that makes the laws pass, that makes the medical facilities open. And then you have the state, right? So you have the people who make the laws, the politicians, but you also have the police and other people who are arresting people, who are kind of criminalizing. All of these things have to work together, right? It's a stool. If one of those goes missing, the whole thing collapses. So we have two kinds of laws that go into effect. The first one is in 1907. It prohibits the marriage of, quote, epileptic, feeble-minded, and insane persons, a misdemeanor for such defectives to have sexual intercourse, as well as to marry, and for anyone to unite such persons in marriage. So even, doing a marriage ceremony would have put you against this law. And then in 1913, the Wisconsin law legalized forced sterilization of the, quote, epileptic, wayward, degenerate, undesirables at the discretion of institutional medical professionals. So, I mean, again, you could just pick apart, what does wayward mean? What does degenerate mean? What does undesirables mean? And then at the discretion of institutional medical professionals. And so the law, specifically lists who they believe these groups of people are who are candidates for sterilization and who were targeted. But the people who were primarily targeted in the practice of the law were, quote, the feeble-minded, because they were more at risk of procreating. So anybody who was more at risk of procreating was more unfairly targeted. Severely disabled persons who were less likely to be able to procreate were institutionalized in long-term care facilities for their entire lives. And so they were less likely to be sterilized. The long-term care facilities, there's a lot of history about how terrible those facilities are, how poor the treatment was, how violent they were. So it was not necessarily better, it was just a different experience. These laws really were focused on the sterilization part. And again, that was Wilmarth's influence. He thought that that was the cheapest, best way to do this. And so a lot of the people who were targeted were people who, were seen either as having some kind of defective, some kind of disability in some way, but also people who were sexually promiscuous, and therefore were possibility to produce, criminals, people who were viewed as insane or mentally ill. Those are the people who were targeted the most. And because of the nature in which society and legislators viewed promiscuity, women were more likely to be labeled as promiscuous than men, and lower class people were more likely to be targeted than upper and middle class women. About 80% of the more than 1,800 people sterilized in Wisconsin between 1913 and the 1960s were women. So 80% of those targeted for forced sterilizations were women. The average age of people sterilized was 21. And we, as the state of Wisconsin, were the 11th in the nation with the most sterilizations. So we were very deeply into our sterilization law. We were very into the eugenics movement. The law was not removed from our state statutes until 1978. It seems most of the forced sterilization stopped in the 60s, but it wasn't removed from the books until 1978. So one of the things I kind of always end this presentation on is, talking about some of the things that I hear when I present on these topics, and some kind of points of reflection. When we talk about histories like eugenics and other histories, these are some of the things that I hear a lot. So one of them is that they were men of their time. That everybody at the time really was in favor of eugenics. And the men of their time argument is usually never a good argument because people are always resisting. There's never a time in history when everybody agreed on everything. And it also gives perspective to those in power, right? Men like Ross, it gives sympathy to their views versus the people who were targeted, and the people who were forcibly sterilized, right? The people who were forcibly sterilized didn't think it was a good idea, and probably weren't in support of being forcibly sterilized. And one of the things I always like to point out, people were against eugenics at the time as well. One of the big factions in Wisconsin of people who were against this idea was actually Catholic Church leaders. So Catholic Church leaders in Wisconsin did not support the 1913 eugenics law. They were really deeply concerned about the state being involved in reproductive matters. They did not think that the state should overstep into, a couple's reproductive life. Social reformers did not always support eugenics either. They favored other types of reforms like better housing, access to jobs and healthcare. They really thought that a lot of the kind of criminal problems that the law was pointing to could actually be solved with more robust social programs. The other one is, that I hear all the time is that, and particularly in an academic context, that, these were noble ideas, right? Fixing society, that's a noble idea. And that these were noble men who thought they were doing the right thing at the time, right? Or who had a good intention. And while we talk about eugenics, I think, it kind of gives cover to this idea that, well, if you're trying to fix society, we might have gone astray, but the overall goal is good, that society should be better. And don't we all want that? I think the problem with this line of thinking is that while the idea in the abstract may have been noble, right, the intent surely was noble. Oh, we want to make society better. The methods were not, and the impacts were not. There were significant impacts, very disastrous, violent impacts for the people who found themselves victimized in these situations. And so the weight of that doesn't equal out to me personally. And I think for a lot of people who study this, and that there are other ways, right? Social reformers had other ideas about how to fix this that didn't require people to be forcibly sterilized against their will or to be incarcerated. And so there were better ways to go about this, right? And other ways that people were talking about even at the time. One of the other things is, eugenics, I think gets kind of, because we use the word eugenics, which sounds very scientific, which has this kind of historical sound to it, it really undergirds, or I think kind of hides and obscures some of the more violent tendencies with the study of eugenics. It's really easy to think about eugenics in the abstract. It's just a way that we improve the human race, and we do that through controlling procreation. But I think it's really important to be clear that eugenics, if it's followed all the way to its logical conclusion, is genocide. The idea is that there is a group of people that we do not believe should exist anymore, that it would be better if they did not exist. And that is genocide. And it targets a population of people in hopes that they will no longer be here. And that is really, disastrously violent. And I think when we use words like eugenics, that's what it's called. That's what the movement and the study was called. It obscures some of that violence. And so I always like to point that out, that if this would have happened in the way that they envisioned it, this wouldn't be here anymore. These people would not be here. And that is extremely violent. And the last one, I think, is that, these ideas continue today. We don't call them eugenics, but that doesn't mean that they're not here. And I think we see them in really big ways and really small ways. So genetic testing, for example, there are prisoners, stories coming out about prisoners who are being forcibly sterilized in California, women who are being forcibly sterilized at the US-Mexico border. All of those come from this really, really deep eugenics history. So it's not enough for us to say, oh, well, isn't it great that Ross and Ellsworth and all these other guys aren't working anymore? Sure, they're not. And also these ideas continue to flourish and really affect us in ways that we don't always see unless we know this history and can make those connections. So, reckoning, right? What is the point? I just gave this kind of short, nice, sweet overview of this very terrible history. So what do we do about it now, right? And I think one of the things about history is we don't always have to have an answer right now. You, as I'm sure I am when I read this history, I'm dealing with a lot of my thoughts and feelings about it. But one of the things is that I know that we do need to do something, right? That we study history for a reason. And so one of the things that I would ask you to think about is, in learning this history and talking about it, hearing about it, what do we want to do next, right? What is the thing that we do after this, after learning this history? And I do have some more resources here that I always share in presentations like this. The Eugenics Archive is incredible. It's like a very interactive website, lots of great materials. It's got people like Edward A. Ross on there talking about everything, but it's also got this kind of big picture history of eugenics down to specific state histories. We have a really good Wiscontext article by Scott Gordon about the history of eugenics in Wisconsin. There's a Wisconsin eugenics history website, and there's a really great master's dissertation from UW from 1983 that's called Children of Misfortune. That was all incredible resource for me in preparing and learning about this history and preparing this presentation, and has a lot about the Chippewa Falls home that I shared with you as well. So I'll leave it there so we can have a discussion and chat further. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Kacie. And one of the great things about hosting a webinar is you get to be the first one to comment. But before I comment, I said that we would do our best to hold this discussion offline so that it could be maybe a little more robust. So before I turn off the recording, I just really want to thank you, Kacie, for all the hard work, digging into stuff that's not very comfortable and trying to make sense out of it 100 years. after it happened. And that takes skill, and that takes knowledge, and that takes passion. So thank you for your skill, knowledge, and passion in bringing this forth. Really do appreciate it.